Hello, and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers, and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. Okay, listeners, today I'm going to tell you about an incredible debut novel. Written by Melbourne-based author Suiter Clarke, Girl 11 is one explosive, engaging, utterly gripping story. Published in Australia and overseas, it's for lovers of true crime and the podcasts that shine a spotlight on cold cases. But I warn you, it's an all-consuming read. Chores be damned. I read it in one nail-biting session. So, on that note, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Amy to the podcast today. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you so much. That's a lovely introduction.
You're so welcome. Wow, it's really all I can say about this book. And the fact that it's your debut deserves a double wow. Truly remarkable. Congratulations. How are you feeling about its reception?
Thank you so much. I'm very excited. I'm especially excited that readers in Australia seem to have really engaged with the book and become really enthusiastic about it, particularly on Instagram. So, shout out to the Australian bookstagrammers for sharing their pictures and their reviews early on about the book and getting people excited about it. It's been really rewarding to see. Obviously, the book is set in Minnesota, in my home state in the US. So you never know how well it's going to do in another country, in another culture. So it's been really lovely to see readers connecting with the characters and the story in such a great way here in Australia.
Amy, I was wondering if you could tell me where the inspiration for Elle's story came from.
Elle's story was actually built around the serial killer in the book story because the idea that I had for this book first was about him and his methods. And I was able to then build Elle as a character to be kind of the perfect foil for this antagonist. And that was a really fun way to build a main character, really to build a, rather than building an antagonist who's the perfect enemy for your main character, doing it the other way around was really fun and really interesting. Elle is a very anxious person. She has experienced a lot of childhood trauma, which motivates her decision to work with children who are victims of crime as a social worker and then to investigate crimes against children as a independent podcaster later on in life. And a lot of that came from Michelle McNamara, who is a US writer who became obsessed with the Golden State Killer case. She actually named him the Golden State Killer. He was known as the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker, both in California. And she was just a writer, someone who created a blog going through her criminal investigations of what she was able to find about this person and eventually ingratiated herself with the local police department and was able to actually work on the investigation actively as a citizen. So she was also a huge inspiration for Elle's character.
Okay, so for those who haven't had the pleasure and the great fortune of reading your story as I have, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about it.
So Girl 11 is about a true crime podcaster, Elle Castillo, who focuses on crimes against children in her home state of Minnesota, which is in the Midwestern part of the US, up north towards Canada, for those who don't know. And she has done several seasons and successfully solved some cold cases with the help of local police who were able to work alongside her and willing to work alongside her to get some fresh eyes on these cold cases. And in her latest season, she is tackling her biggest case yet, the notorious Countdown Killer who terrorized Minnesota 20 years prior to the events of the podcast by kidnapping and killing women each a year younger than the last. And he was never caught. And he stopped with his 11-year-old victim, and no one ever knew why. No one knew what happened to him. A lot of people think that he died, and Elle is convinced that he's still alive and has never been brought to justice. So her goal with this latest season is to bring the case back into the public eye, hopefully dig up some new clues, find some people who are willing to talk who weren't willing to talk before, and see if she can't identify who this countdown killer is and finally solve the crimes.
Your book is the latest in a number of books that I've read where we have a civilian undertaking crime solving. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, the True Crime podcast is one of those modern mediums which have been credited with helping to solve cold crime cases. So I wanted to ask you, was this something you specifically wanted to explore and why?
Yeah, so when I started the draft for this, Elle was actually just a regular detective. She wasn't an amateur investigator, but I didn't want to write a story, yet another story of a detective breaking all the rules and going against police protocols to solve the crime and that sort of thing. And that was really what was happening because Elle has uh, she has such a vendetta for this case at the expense of all other things. And so having her be a detective working on this cold case just wasn't really realistic. And I was really into true crime podcasts at the time. I still enjoy them, but even more so a few years ago when I started drafting this. And so eventually it just came about that it made more sense for her to be an amateur investigator. And I thought, a podcast would be a really great way for her to be able to score some interviews with key people. By that point, podcasts have become enough of a mainstream and recognizable thing that, even police, particularly retired police and detectives, were willing to be featured on cases. And often these cases have haunted them as well, that they were never able to solve them. And so they're willing to kind of explore new ways of getting the public's attention and getting clues. And so I thought it was a good way for Elle to be able to investigate this case. And it was also an interesting way for me as an author to be able to talk about what life was like when the countdown killer was active and how that impacted the community without doing just a bunch of flashback scenes, which can get quite boring.
Yeah, I guess on that point, I wanted to chat to you a little bit about the structure of the book, which I found fascinating from a writer's point of view. And as you say, rather than just delving into a whole bunch of flashbacks, you've got Elle talking about the countdown killer and his modus operandi, in recorded podcast form. Tell me about your decision to structure it that way.
As I said, a big part of it was an authorial decision of I want to be able to portray this history and the experiences of this community without just doing flashbacks. And so, a good way of doing that felt fresh was to do these interviews. And anyone who listens to podcasts recognizes these types of interviews that happen with the victims of crimes and cold cases and their frustration at how long it's been and that their family members never received justice. So it felt like something that I could really tap into. But the other aspect of it was just trying to reveal different elements of the story, different elements of the plot and the characters, and also revealing something about Elle through her podcast, not just through the transcripts of the actual published podcast, but there are transcripts in the book of her recording things that don't ever make it to air and how she kind of uses her microphone as a way of processing emotions and processing the things that are happening to her and her frustrations with the case and frustrations as an investigator. So the podcast I really see as like Elle's polished, like best self
Mhm.
and the way that she kind of wants to be. She wants the world to see her. And then her point of view chapters are really who she is, which is much more like how we all are
Yeah.
when we haven't had time to sort of script the things that we say and decide what things make it to air and make it to the public.
So on that point, Amy, I wondered, apart from listening to lots of true crime podcasts yourself, what other research did you do to bring Elle's story to the page?
A lot of the podcasts that I listened to weren't just true crime podcasts or weren't just investigative podcasts like Justice Delayed, which is Elle's podcast in the book, but they were podcasts about criminal investigation from the point of view of FBI profilers, police, lawyers, etc. So I really wanted to have a good handle on how this kind of case would be investigated and the types of avenues that they would take to solve it. And that also gave me an opportunity to hear from different experts in things like medical examination and DNA analysis and that sort of thing, which all factor into the book also. So podcasts, one of the things I love about them is they make really good research tools for that sort of thing, because every expert you could ever hope for has probably been on a podcast at some point and done interviews about their work, and it's really fascinating to listen to. I also read the famous book Mindhunter by John Douglas, who was at the forefront of developing the practice of behavioral analysis. And I was able to talk with experts just via email, experts in DNA analysis and things like that, so that I knew that I was getting those parts of the book right.
All made up for a very, very compelling, tightly woven story. Fantastic. So, Amy, were the murders based on a real case?
No, the pattern and the method of murder and that sort of thing was all invented. I did take a lot of inspiration from the Golden State Killer case. I think that was in the news a lot when I was writing this book, so I think that's part of the reason it so heavily influenced it. First, because Michelle McNamara's book I'll Be Gone in the Dark came out around that time and did so well, and it was such an incredibly crafted book. And secondly, because the man responsible was actually finally arrested and was caught through genetic genealogy and DNA analysis. And I really wanted to capture that feeling of a community that is under attack, and how it feels to feel constantly under threat, and that even in the places that you feel you should be safe, that most women and girls don't ever feel truly safe, particularly when they're by themselves. And really the injustice of that as well. And I cover that a little bit in the book, of the response to women and girls not feeling safe is often to limit their movements rather than trying to find the root cause of the problem.
Yeah.
And, for example, saying we're going to put a curfew on all men because we know this killer's probably a man. So we're going to say all men have to be home by 7 p.m. And that gives women a little bit more feeling of security. The opposite is true. There's often a curfew put on women in these kinds of scenarios, especially sort of in the 90s and 80s when that thing happened. And we get it backwards, really, in terms of whose movements we're limiting and whose freedom we're limiting in this kind of situation.
I actually did read a bunch of articles about the Golden State Killer quite some time ago, related to something that I was looking for, in researching my own manuscript. It was the first time that genealogy testing, the ancestry.com type of testing was actually used to solve a cold case.
It was among the first. I think that there was one or two cases that were solved prior to his, but they were being investigated at the same time. So it was really just a matter of timing whose case, they finally turned up first. There's a podcast called Bear Brook that is about these bodies found in barrels, I think in New Hampshire, and how it took so many years to figure out who they were. And I believe that at least one of the victims, was only finally identified around the same time in 2018 with genetic genealogy.
Yeah.
And again, I think that was the first, if not one of the first as well.
Yeah, incredible how, the advances in technology are helping in crime solving, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Amy, I wondered, did you think that true crime podcasts and the important work that they're doing serves to undermine the public's confidence in law enforcement?
I think that that's obviously a concern that people have, but I also feel that it's a little bit of a false dichotomy that, police have always relied on the community to help them solve crimes. That's been the case since they've been invented, and which was really only a few hundred years ago. And prior to that, communities were responsible. They worked together to solve crimes and respond to injustices in their community. So it's actually really new, this idea of the elite investigator that doesn't need any help from anyone to be able, that they just are such a mastermind that they can solve crimes. So I think that, you know, the advent of true crime podcasts has really just given a channel for people who have always done this kind of work. There have always been citizen detectives, quote unquote, or armchair detectives as they've come to be known in the computer age, of, people that just they find a case that they just can't get out of their head. Often there's a personal connection because it was in their town or it happened to someone they knew, and they are the reason that the police even stay on that case, that they are just constantly pursuing it and trying to bring clues forward, and talking to people and that sort of thing. So I think that that's always existed. And my feeling, particularly when it comes to a cold case, is if it's just going to be sitting on a dusty shelf, why wouldn't you want someone who was really passionate, who had a fresh set of eyes, to come in and look at the evidence and see if they could come up with a new idea?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's marvelous. But it was just so interesting to me that, certainly Elle received some pushback from the police department in terms of her involvement and the fact that she is a civilian, with a microphone.
Hmm.
And, she was getting death threats and quite a bit of anger out there in the community, despite all the good things that she was doing.
Yeah, I think people get really tied to their idea of the police and what the police do, and they don't want to hear it really when there's
Mm.
any challenge to that authority, which is, police, at least in the US, the average homicide clearing rate is around 50 or 60%. Like, that's extremely low if
Mm.
you really think about, like,
Yeah.
if you or I at our job only did 50% of our work,
Yeah, we wouldn't have a job.
we would be held accountable for that in one way or another.
Yeah.
So I think if the public could say 99% of the time or 90% of the time the police will solve this, then they might have a stronger case to say that civilians should stay out of it.
Mm.
Um, but really, the clues that come forward to police that help them solve crimes are almost always connected to the community. It's someone who saw something, someone who recognized, a person in their life based on a police sketch or something like that. They rely on people to come forward. So I just think, why not embrace that?
So, the one thing that Elle has to face in the course of her investigation is the possibility that by revealing the Countdown Killer's modus operandi and discussing his crimes and victims on the podcast, that it may have inspired copycat killers. So, I wondered if you thought this was a real phenomenon.
I think that it can be a real phenomenon, but usually I haven't heard of this happening in the case of a serial killer necessarily,
Hmm.
but we often see that kind of pattern when it comes to things like mass shooters or the quote unquote lone wolf, white supremacist terrorist, for example, that they are often inspired by people who have done the same things. And we can see patterns in just purely observational. I haven't done studies on this obviously myself, but
Mm.
purely observationally, those types of attacks often cluster together. And so I think that there is a concern when you're talking about reporting on any type of crime, to consider whether you're presenting it in a way that would encourage people to emulate that crime. And a big part of that I cover a little bit in the book is whether you're focusing on the killer and their methods and their mindset, or you're focusing on the victims and the impact on them and on their community. I think that makes a big difference in whether your type of reporting is conducive to inspiring copycats.
Yeah. So, whether or not you're giving oxygen to the killer or whether you're focusing on the impact.
Absolutely. Like, I had such deep respect for New Zealand with the horrifying mosque shootings that happened a
Yeah.
couple of years ago, that they never shared the perpetrator's name, that was a conscious decision. Obviously that name was out there if you were looking for it, but when that was reported on from New Zealand, when they did the trial, they were very careful not to give oxygen and attention to that person, not to give them notoriety. And I think that does make a huge difference.
Okay, so as I mentioned, Girl 11 is your debut novel. So I wanted to ask you, Amy, did you always want to be a writer?
I started out wanting to be a writer, and then I kind of changed my mind and thought I was going to be an actor for a little while. So I wrote a lot of stories when I was younger, probably between like 10 and 14 or so. I wrote a lot of stories just on my own, and we had a personal computer at home, which wasn't the norm necessarily at the time, but my dad was very interested in that, so I used the computer to write my stories. And then I got interested in acting as an older teenager, and that was what I did my undergraduate degree in. And after I did that, I became interested in writing again, actually through fan fiction, which I
Mm.
used to be ashamed to admit, but now I know
Oh,
so many writers who came to writing through fan fiction that, it's almost common at this point. And I had such lovely responses to the fan fiction that I wrote that I actually thought, oh, I might be able to do this. That motivated me to apply for a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing. And I really wanted to live in London. So I figured I would just do those things at the same time because I
yeah.
needed an excuse to move there. And I got into Kingston University and went and did my 2-year degree, master's degree there in 2011. And that was when I really started to get serious about writing and started more with a literary bent to my work, and then eventually sort of gradually shifted over to more thriller suspense writing.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your journey to publication? Is Girl 11 your first manuscript? You mentioned that Elle was, in a previous draft, a detective. How did you start and where did you go?
I had quite a long journey to publication, which is not unheard of by any means. So the novel that I wrote that I started during my master's degree became the first full manuscript that I wrote, and that was how I got my literary agent in the US, and that was in 2015. And so we went out on submission with that, after a couple rounds of edits, and unfortunately that didn't sell. So I got to work writing another book and went through that process. That took about 2 years. And then that went out on submission and unfortunately didn't sell. And so then I started writing Girl 11. By the time I drafted and then redrafted it, and this was all in consultation with my agent as well. So she became a huge part of the reason that with the shift to the podcast element rather than the detective element, that was based on feedback from her in terms of knowing that the L as a detective wasn't working. So that took about 2 years. So we went out on submission with that in 2019. And thankfully, unlike previous submissions, it was snapped up really quickly. I had an offer within 3 weeks. So I accepted that and then got subsequent offers from other countries, which was incredible and made it very difficult to sleep because my agents are in New York City. So I was always waking up to emails with more news about what was going on. So it was very difficult not to just stay awake and watch my emails. There's kind of a common joke in writing and publishing that you wait and wait and wait and wait and then it's everything happens all at once. And it does kind of feel like that, and it felt like that at the time. It was very, very exciting but also very overwhelming because it felt like it changed overnight after years of working towards that goal.
What a fantastic story. I love it. So, Amy, are you working on something else at the moment?
I am. I'm working on my second book. It's been a little bit of a challenge. I think the pandemic and the preparing for release of Girl 11 and all of that has been obviously quite distracting, but I am heavily into redrafting actually. I had a first draft of the novel that didn't quite work, so now I'm in the process of reshaping that. So fingers crossed I can get that done this year.
So, Amy, I don't know if you know, but there are lots of aspiring writers and authors that listen to this podcast. So, I was wondering, given your experiences, if you had any tips to offer.
Yeah, so the first advice that I kind of offer to every writer, and that's therefore couches any other advice that I give, is that you should only take writing tips that you feel work for you. I think that there's a lot of prescriptive writing advice or writing directives of what it means, what you have to do to be a real writer. And I think that none of it is true. And that the only thing that makes you a writer is if you write. And so my first bit of advice is just to take any advice with a grain of salt and find the ones that work for you and inspire you. I obviously would recommend that you read a lot and write a lot and practice, writing things that make you happy, write things that interest you rather than trying to write toward some kind of trend or thing that you think will be a mega bestseller, because nobody knows what the magic sauce is in terms of what's going to be the next big thing, what's going to be the next big breakout novel. Even if it is known or curated, is not done by the author, it's done by the publisher through marketing and publicity and that sort of thing. So if you write a book that comes from your heart and that is on a topic that you're passionate about, readers can sense that, and I think that that's what makes readers connect to a story.
Amy, where can listeners learn more about you and your books?
My website is www.asuiterclarke.com, or you can just Google me, Amy Suiter Clarke. I would be the first result, probably, with slightly unique name, thankfully. You can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, although I don't post a lot on there, at Suiter Clarke. I love to hear from people, so feel free to add me or follow me, and I'd be happy to connect.
Amy, congratulations once again on the publication of Girl 11. I'm so glad to have found it and you. And I wanted to wish you every success with this book. May it fly off the shelves. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Thank you so much. It's been really great to talk with you.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.